This podcast contains discussions of child abuse, sexual repression and sexual abuse, suicide, racism, misogyny, PTSD and PTSD symptoms, and spiritual oppression and abuse, including guilt, shame, and fear. In most episodes, we will be mentioning some of these concepts in a general way without any graphic detail. If any of these topics or other triggering topics will be mentioned in great detail, we will let you know at the beginning of each individual episode, as well as in the show notes for that episode.
Rolling river of time, you've healed me in too many days. No regrets, no confusion, there'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways.
Welcome to the Leaving Eden podcast. To our new listeners, welcome. To our returning listeners, welcome back. It's been a wild few weeks, but here we are. And by we, I mean myself, Gavriel Hacohen, and my co-host.
Hi, I'm Sadie Carpenter.
And I want to waste zero time in getting into what we want to talk about today, because this is not a normal episode. Because normally we schedule these episodes like months in advance, and record them probably 5 to 6 weeks in advance, and then we release them. But this episode, we had to get this researched, written, recorded very quickly because it's very relevant to an ongoing issue. So we decided to bump it up in the schedule, to write, record, and put it all out in a week. So we did have an interview that we had recorded with a guest, but we're going to air that next year sometime. We just had to, this was just such a pressing issue that we just had to get it in right away.
Yeah, and this is totally trying something new for us. So we're hoping that it works out to do these more time-sensitive episodes. We noticed that sometimes there is breaking news, and we want to discuss it with you, our listeners, as it's happening. We want you to get the energy of when one of us texts each other. It's like, oh my God, did you see this thing?
Did you see the latest David Hiles scandal?
Right. The last time this happened was the new Dave Hiles scandal about the lady that he was video calling in some other country. And we didn't get to air our discussion about that until weeks later. And I really felt bad. I felt like our listeners missed out on getting our takes and having our discussion and being a part of mine and yours finding out about this.
Yeah.
So today we're going to do this episode about something we only recently learned, and we'll see how this goes, and we'll see if this will work for breaking news in the future.
Yeah, and so speaking of listeners, this was a piece of information that was brought to our attention by a listener.
Thank you, listener.
Yeah, and so this information is that so Jonathan Mattingly, who is one of the police officers in Louisville, Kentucky, that was involved in the fatal shooting of Breonna Taylor. And this is one of those instances of Black people dying at the hands of police. That was one of the things that really sparked a lot of this civil unrest that went on this year in 2020. So this man, Jonathan Mattingly, was at least at one point in his life a member of the Independent Fundamental Baptist at one of their churches.
Yes. So there's so much to unpack here.
Yeah, there is a lot to unpack here. But basically what we found out was that in the ABC, in the 2020 documentary, it was just a passing detail that, in what was it, 1991, he said, I want to go to Hyles Anderson College and then come back and study to be a police officer. This guy, 18. And nobody would have thought anything about that. But then, if you're like us and you're sort of tuned into these issues, if you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't have seen it. But we saw that, this was brought to our attention. We're like, oh, whoa, this needs a second look.
Right. So somebody who didn't know what Hyles Anderson College was wouldn't have thought anything, that's just some college I've never heard of, whatever.
Yeah.
But if you know,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you're able to pick out, he was, okay, why was he going to Hyles Anderson College? Was this guy in the IFB? What is going on here? So we did a little bit of digging to
we did do a bit of
what's
digging.
going on. do you want to talk about... Okay, let's talk about who this guy is.
Yeah, so this guy's name is Jonathan Mattingly. He is, I guess he currently still is an officer of a police officer in the Louisville Police Department, on their police force. I think he's been placed on administrative leave because of the shooting of Breonna Taylor, but he was not the officer who was charged, who was given charges. I think that he was one of the ones who was they declined to charge him, to bring charges against him.
Yeah, that's correct. There were like 7 officers on executing the no-knock warrant in the middle of the night at Breonna Taylor's house.
Yes.
So Jonathan Mattingly is the one who was shot by Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, who was a legal gun owner.
Yeah, he was a legal gun owner, and
yes.
What I read in the interview was that this Jonathan Mattingly was shot. The bullet grazed his leg, I believe, is what happened. He wasn't like shot. It was like a very, it like grazed his leg, but that was, they heard gunshots go in, guns blazing. Breonna Taylor gets killed.
Right. So Matt, the way he tells the story, if you listen to the Mattingly interview on ABC.
And also, if you read the interview with him, it is also on ABC's website.
Right. There's lots of information there, but the way he tells the story, he thought he got hit in the femoral artery, and he thought he was dying, according to him.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is one of the people that was involved in the Breonna Taylor shooting. And I think we can get a little bit more into like what happened and what he had to say about what happened in a minute.
Right.
I want to explain what this is about going to Hyles-Anderson for 1 year.
Yes. Because this is something that because when you were like, you went to Hyles-Anderson, but the emphasis for you, at least because you were on this Jericho student loan program or whatever, you were on this Jericho program. So they were going to try to get you there for 4 years. So
right. By the time I went there, the culture was very different. It was go for 4 years. Don't just come for 1 year. You if you go, you need to go until you graduate.
Yeah, so why would somebody go to Hyles-Anderson College for 1 year?
So this was a thing back in, I would say, the 80s through the early 2000s. So for quite a while, this was a thing that you did. If you were a young person growing up in an IFB church, and keep in mind, this is during the height of the IFB movement. This is when IFB churches had the most people.
And Jack Hyles was still alive during this time.
Right. Hyles is still alive. Hyles-Anderson is huge. When I went there, we were barely over 1,000 students, and I think that number was a lie. At this point in time, Hyles-Anderson was like 2,500 students, so over twice the size of when I was there.
So much, much, much bigger.
Yeah. So this is the thing that you would do if you were a young person growing up in the IFB, but you didn't want to pursue a career in the ministry. So you wanted to be a police officer, or you wanted to be a nurse or an architect or whatever.
Yeah, and Jonathan Mattingly, like he said, I want to be a police officer, but I'm going to go to the IFB school for 1 year. I'm going to go to Hyles-Anderson for 1 year. Then I'm going to go back to Louisville, study criminal justice, be a cop.
Right. So this is something that you would do, and it was often to kind of appease IFB parents. Like your parents would say, well, I guess I'll support you being a police officer or a nurse or whatever if you'll go to Hyles-Anderson for 1 year first. And Jonathan Mattingly's father is Lonnie Mattingly, who's a fairly well-known preacher within the IFB and pastored Shawnee Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky for many, many years.
Okay, so this guy, it would have been like socially expected for him to be going to Hyles. Like if the pastor's kid didn't go to this school for like at least 1 year, that would have raised some eyebrows.
Right. So this is likely, and this is conjecture, but this is likely the kind of situation where his dad said, I understand that you don't want to go into the ministry, and like whatever, I'm not going to change your mind about this, but you have to go to Hyles-Anderson for a year first.
So there's going to be social pressure to do that. Like, is there any other reason why you would go to Hyles-Anderson for just 1 year?
Yeah, there are definitely a couple. So I can kind of give you some insight into why there was that social pressure.
Yeah.
First, I wanted to say we can absolutely confirm that Mattingly did enroll in Hyles-Anderson in the fall of 1991. We found a 1992 Hyles-Anderson yearbook, and his picture is in the freshman section.
Yeah, and so if you check our Instagram account, then you will be able to see that picture there. But we can confirm, in fact, that that Jonathan Mattingly was at Hyles-Anderson College from the fall of 1991 to the spring of 1992.
Right. So here are some reasons that the IFB system would pressure you into going to Hyles-Anderson for 1 year.
Okay.
So
Shoot.
the idea was that you would go, number one, it's like a test to see if being in a secular, non-religious job is really the will of God for you. Or if you would go, so you go to Hyles-Anderson and you've got chapel every single day. You've got 3 church services a week. So that's 8 church services a week. And then you've got bus meeting on Saturday. So, you're in between 8 and 12 church services every single week.
They really throw you in the deep end there, don't they?
Yeah. And you're going soul winning, and all of your classes are religiously based. And basically, if you're not really, really dead set in the idea of, no, I want to be, this other career that's not in the IFB church system. If you're not dead set on it, going to Hyles-Anderson for a year is a real good way to get talked out of it. And to get talked into. And remember, I told you about the religious experience that you have, like when you get called to do something.
Yes.
So you go to Hyles-Anderson and you get called to do something in like Hyles-Anderson Chapel. And then you give up on whatever that other career was.
So maybe your dad is an IFB pastor and he sends you to Hyles-Anderson, and then he sends like a note to Jack Hyles. He's like, hey, Jack, my boy wants to be a cop, but I'd rather him do, really go into the ministry instead.
So he can take over my church from me when I'm old.
Yeah, you want to see if you can do anything about this? And then Jack Hyles is going to be like, Jonathan, you're going to, Jesus is calling you. God is calling you. And then how are you going to say no to that?
Yeah, so the terminology.
This is all hypothetical. We don't know that any of this actually
but no,
happened.
that your idea of how this could happen is dead on.
Yeah.
Definitely the terminology that would be used is, you have to know the code speak to know the code speak. But no, that's totally a possible thing that can happen. So, when I was...
Do we have any documented instances of this?
When I was growing up, I wanted to be a nurse because my grandmother, who I loved dearly and was incredibly influential on my life, was a nurse. And until I realized that I'm freaked out by blood, I really wanted... before I realized that I don't have the stomach for it at all, I really wanted to be a nurse like my grandmother. And my dad told me that he would... And my dad's not, nearly as manipulative as other hypothetical IFB fathers that we're talking about. But he told me that he would support me, but I would have to go to Hyles-Anderson for 1 year first. And then if I did that and I still felt like it was God's will for me to be a nurse, then I could go to nursing school and go on and do that.
Wow. Okay, then. I guess that's a good example.
Yeah. So this is, and if you go to Hyles-Anderson Chapel, it's a very, very common thing to have throughout the course of the year, people still surrendering, people still getting called to preach, who went to Hyles-Anderson and weren't considering themselves called to be a preacher or called to be a missionary. So even in chapel services at Hyles-Anderson, you're still having people get saved. You're still having Hyles-Anderson students get baptized. You're having people get called to preach, called to be a missionary. I've seen this happen dozens, if not hundreds of times.
Interesting.
So another reason that you might get pressured into going to Hyles-Anderson for, just 1 year before you start your career. One reason, and the other main reason would be to find an appropriate IFB spouse. So they're thinking
okay,
like,
that makes
okay,
sense. Yeah.
if this guy really wants to grow up and be a police officer, you know, we're not going to be able to stop him from doing that or force him into the ministry, but we can keep him in the IFB system and we can keep his tithe money and we can keep his children in the system as long as he marries an IFB woman who will keep him in line and like keep him in church and raise their children in church.
Okay, no, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect, because you know, you get a bunch of like-minded people together, and you know, some of them are going to fall for each other. That's just kind of how this works.
And there's also such a focus on dating at Hyles-Anderson, like I've told you before about Jack Scopp making all the men who didn't have a date to certain college activity, like the Valentine's banquet or whatever, making them stand up in chapel, and then like making them ask like, okay, well, all the girls who don't have a date stand up, and then like having a, you know, making people ask each other out in front of the entire student body in chapel. Like it's like a humiliation tactic. If you don't ask, like if you don't ask somebody out, I'm going to make you ask somebody out. And like encouraging, you know, everybody has to have a date to this activity. So with that kind of dating culture, one of two things could happen. One, you could find an appropriate like IFB spouse and get engaged really quickly and then stay engaged for a while. Maybe the spouse or the other person was still finishing school at Hyles-Anderson and you ended up going into your secular career, but then you'd get back together and be an IFB family. Or you would get a boyfriend or girlfriend, and then your boyfriend or girlfriend would get counseled by the teachers at Hyles-Anderson to encourage you to come back for just one more year. And then it's just one more until you've been suckered into graduating from Hyles-Anderson and giving them all the money that entails.
Yeah. But suffice to say, like, you would not be a student at Hyles-Anderson Bible College unless you were like hardcore IFB, unless you were like all the way in. Unless
you were, or your family was, or both.
Right.
So, that's the background of why you might go to Hyles-Anderson for just 1 year. And that's what immediately came to mind when I saw this background image about Jonathan Mattingly. But knowing that his father was a prominent IFB pastor, when you put all these pieces together, it totally 100% makes sense. The only thing I wasn't able to track down was whether his wife was ever a Hyles-Anderson student, because
we don't have her name.
Right, and I frankly I don't feel like we need it.
Yeah, and I don't feel like
she didn't do anything.
If we had her name, we wouldn't want to say it on this podcast anyway, because that's really just not.
Like, I'm not responsible for my husband's actions. Why would I hold this woman responsible for her husband's actions?
Yeah, I mean, the IFB believes that she would be responsible for her husband's actions, but that's not us.
That's gross and wrong.
Whoever she is, that's entirely immaterial to anything that he's done.
Right.
So, yeah. So basically, we have all of this information because Mattingly gave an interview to ABC. And so what we're trying to do here is really just kind of contextualize all of this. So I don't know if you read this interview. I read the interview. And in the interview, because I believe he is the only one of the officers who was involved in this police shooting to speak out publicly. Am I right about that?
I'm not 100% sure, but that does sound right to me.
I haven't seen anything from any of the other officers. But so when I watched the interview and I read the interview, and he spoke very like apologetically, sort of. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Is that okay? So
I totally want to hear what you mean by that, because I know what I think about it.
Yeah. So he said all these things about her. Is like, I regret that Breonna Taylor was killed. And he said that like her death will haunt me forever, you know, things like that. And so then he goes on to say things like, okay, well, the police used X tactic when they should have used Y tactic. and they should have they waited this amount of time before barging into the apartment when they should have done it right away. And that's basically what he's like. And if we had done this differently and this differently and this differently, she wouldn't have been killed. But never in the interview does he say, which is the fact of the matter is that they shouldn't have ever been at that apartment to begin with, because they were operating off of bad information, right?
Exactly.
I mean, that's the case. Like, they were operating off of bad information. Like, the guy that they were looking for wasn't even there. And even though they were like, we were 100% sure that this guy was going to be there, he wasn't there. And that nobody who was there, so Breonna and her boyfriend, neither of them were suspected even of any crime. And like, then additionally, he maintains that the police officers who were there, they announced that they were police, and like, despite the fact that they had a no-knock warrant, so they weren't legally required to, and despite the fact that like witnesses contradicted this statement, so the witnesses said, yeah, they didn't announce that they were police, but he and all of the police officers said, yeah, we definitely announced it. You can decide who you believe. But what I see the problem is here is that police are, he didn't admit that police are like running around with no-knock search warrants based on bad information, because, I mean, that wouldn't just implicate the police department, because that would also implicate the entire judicial system in Louisville, which operates in tandem with the police department. Because, to get a search warrant for somebody's house, you've got to say, we believe there is evidence of X crime being committed or whatever in this house. And for you to get a no-knock search warrant, you have to have evidence that either A, the person's going to like jump and run, or B, they're going to destroy the evidence before you can get in. Like, if it's like they were suspecting drugs in this case, so they're like, oh, well, we suspect that they're going to like flush the drugs down the toilet or something like that, and so that's where they would have a no-knock warrant. But there's like a higher degree of stringency, which like there is a higher degree of like evidence which you have to have in order to get a no-knock warrant, as opposed to a regular search warrant. Like, a regular search warrant, you have to knock on the door, you have to be like, we're going to search your house, and then they wait while you search it. This is like a level above that. So the fact that like the police are running around with no-knock search warrants in Louisville based on bad information, that would be a stunning indictment of the entire judicial system of that city. So, like, to me, like, maybe Mattingly does really feel bad about this involvement with Breonna Taylor's death, but he doesn't feel bad enough to actually give us the story that makes any sense about what happened. He doesn't feel bad enough to not deflect the blame from the police department, or the institution, which is the institution that he's defending. Exactly.
And it's really interesting that he is expending so much energy to defend an institution like that. That is why we'll get there anyway. What this sound like this is clearly like the police officers in this situation had poor training, and then also incredibly poor policies. And like, that is integral to why this happened. But I agree with you about like what the vibe that I'm getting when I hear Mattingly speaking, because I watched a good bit of interview footage of him speaking about the shooting, and I absolutely agree. I get the same vibe as you, that he feels like he didn't do anything wrong, and he wants everybody to know about how much he feels like he didn't do anything wrong. But I agree. I do get the feeling that he does, to some extent, sincerely feel bad about his involvement and the fact that Breonna Taylor died. But you hit it on the head.
I'm sure he does. Who wouldn't?
Right. Like, and I mean,
like, he's not soulless. I'm not trying to say that he's soulless or like inhuman or like a sociopath or just like somebody who just doesn't care about other people.
But like, he doesn't, there's a disconnect. Like, he doesn't feel quite bad enough for whatever reason, or he doesn't feel like he's able to say, I was wrong, or we were wrong, or no knock warrants in the middle of the night are usually wrong, or Breonna's boyfriend Kenneth Walker was doing what every Second Amendment supporter spends hours talking about how they would do the same thing.
Yeah, the police come for me, like, what are they going to do? I've got guns, I can take them on. Like,
I've heard people say, like, I have 2A friends, like, I don't live in a complete liberal bubble. And I have liberal 2A friends too. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm liberal 2A people. They exist. They're everywhere.
There are more and more of them recently, if you notice.
A lot of them. Yeah.
But like, that's what 2A people say all the time. It's like, oh, if somebody bursts into my house in the middle of the night and they say they have a gun, I'm going to be able to take them down. And for whatever reason, Jonathan Mattingly does not feel like he's capable of admitting personal guilt or institutional guilt, which sounds, and this is what we made this podcast episode about, this sounds very IFB.
Yeah. Like, I don't think we would have done this episode if it was just like, oh, this guy happened to be a member of the IFB. We don't really have anything else other than that. Like, we're doing this because he gave an interview and he did the XYZ thing that we're like, okay, well, you wouldn't see that if you were looking at it normally, but because we know what to look for.
Right. Like, if you don't know what the IFB is, you just see a guy who doesn't want to take responsibility for what happened, or doesn't want to put responsibility on his department, or doesn't want to put responsibility on the justice system in Louisville, or the court system, or whoever's favorite judge, or whatever. But knowing that this is an IFB guy totally changes the perspective on this.
Right. And you have more experience with IFB guys than I do. But one thing that I also want to point out is that he is still apparently under internal review from the Louisville Police Department. And of course, we always hear about police departments having a sort of, it's what the blue wall of silence. Mm-hmm. So if you say anything that could implicate any of your other officers, then it's going to, then when it comes down to either internal reviews or preferential treatment or poor treatment at the hands of other officers, like, you're going to be one of the ones that's going to get the short end of the stick. Mm-hmm. So if he's still under investigation, he's not going to be able to say anything against the department.
Right.
Because the department's also got his fate in the balance.
But you know what that sounds so much like?
What does that sound like? Tell me.
The internal reviews that an IFB church does when someone on their staff sexually abuses someone. The internal review that First Baptist Church of Hammond conducted over Jack Scobb. The internal review that has happened every time there's been a Hyles Anderson staff member sex scandal. The internal reviews, by the way, that Lonnie Mattingly's church conducted when they had 3 child abuse sex scandals in about 18 months in the 90s.
Wait, so you're telling me, Jonathan...
Man, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm putting on my Joe Rogan voice for this podcast because I'm yelling a lot. But I'm drinking coffee and I feel very passionate.
Well, I mean, but I want to back up right there because Lonnie Mattingly is Jonathan Mattingly's father. Mm-hmm. Lonnie Mattingly, IFB preacher at a church in Louisville, mm-hmm. and at this church, and this is presumably the church that Jonathan grew up in, that he presumably went back to after he finished his year at Hyles Anderson College. We can't say this for sure, but this is what's sort of expected, that you go back home, you're mm-hmm. gonna.
As far as we know, this is what happened in the church. I double checked myself. It is called Shawnee Baptist Church.
Shawnee Baptist Church, and so you're saying that during this time after Jonathan was. He did his year as Hyles Anderson, goes back to Louisville.
As far as we know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And during these years, there is sexual abuse scandals at his father's church.
Right.
Just going to say that we have no evidence. We are not suggesting that Jonathan was at all involved in these sex scandals.
Right. We don't even know for sure that he was attending his father's church at the time. We just assume he probably was based on, things that he said, IFB culture, so on and so forth.
Yeah. So we're not accusing him of being a sexual abuser in any way. That would be wrong for us to do that because we don't have any evidence of that.
No, we're accusing his father of being someone who covers up for sex abusers.
Right.
And this is based on a testimony of somebody that I am not able to name at this point. This was posted by a incredibly reputable source in a private group for IFB survivors.
So you have it on good information,
incredibly good authority
that you would stake your reputation on that this is true.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like
Okay.
I know the person peripherally who posted this. I'm just not able to say their name.
Right.
Okay. So in 1993, so this is the year that we assume Jonathan Mattingly came home from Hyles-Anderson. So we're assuming that he saw all of this go down at his father's church.
So he goes to Hyles-Anderson for 1991, fall of 1991, spring of 1992, comes home that summer.
And then 1993, the next year, very familiar story within the IFB, child sex abuse cover-up, an assistant pastor with the last name of Crowley, which is a real shame. That's a waste of a great last name. Like Aleister Crowley, but...
Mr. Crowley.
Exactly what's been in my head all day as I've been getting this episode ready.
We're both metalheads, and Ozzy Osbourne is like the Yoda of metal.
We need a whole episode on Ozzy at some point.
We will.
Okay.
But back to this very serious matter.
But Mr. Crowley.
Sorry, we keep getting sidetracked.
This guy with the last name Crowley, he was raping a 6th grade bus kid.
Oh.
And the church supported.
That's horrible.
Yeah, 6th grade girl, 11 or 12. Heartbreaking and disgusting and terrible. The church supported this guy and they believed that he was innocent, gave him money, supported him right up until the day that he was removed from church property in handcuffs. The very next year, so within 12 months of that,
it's disgusting.
Another assistant pastor, whose name is Jim Cawley, was raping a 15-year-old student from the Christian school. And again, this one was covered up. Pastor Mattingly reportedly said, quote, "Leave now and I will give you a good recommendation. Stay and I will have to tell the girl's father."
Oh.
And since the girl's father had just donated millions to the church, no one wanted to tell him. So Mattingly let this dude pull a Dave Hyles and sent him to another church.
Well, this guy pulled a Jack Hyles and sent an abuser, like a known abuser, somewhere else in the country, so that
and gave him a good recommendation. Yeah. And what in IFB code speak, by the way, I wanted to speak to the stay and I will have to tell the girl's father. In IFB code, what he is doing is he is treating this as an affair and not as a rape. Just to be clear on what that means, I will have to tell her father. That's a coded message there. So yeah, Lonnie Mattingly, the father, pulls a Jack Hyles, sends this dude to another place where he can hurt other people. And within that same year, there was another sex scandal. A 24-year-old female teacher from the Christian school was having a ongoing sexual relationship with a 15 or 16-year-old teenage boy from the Christian school. Which is also rape, because we would say
really
that
skeezy,
because that's the same age difference between Dave Hyles and his teenage victims. So
yeah, no, that
so this is gross.
Okay.
This is disgusting. And then to put my final thought on this, those 3 scandals, the information I got about them, I was not able to find police records for those, probably just because they were covered up. But I do want to cover my butt and say that is based on one person's incredibly credible, but one person's testimony. But anyway, yeah, that's the kind of bullshit that Jonathan Mattingly saw his father pull when Jonathan Mattingly would have been a young man just in his early 20s.
And Lonnie Mattingly remained the pastor at this church up until what year?
2009, I think.
2009. So
Ish.
covers up 3 sex scandals within 18 months.
And who knows how many more there were.
And then gets to be and then keeps his ministry for another 15 years until he retires at for what I assume is because he's old, not because
he went into, so I looked up what the dad did. He went into evangelism, I think, for a little while. He was a pastor. He was an assistant pastor at another church for a little bit, and now he is pastoring a very small church. I think it's in rural Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
But he's gone on to semi-retirement pastoring a very small church of only about 30, 40 people.
So growing up as the child of an IFB pastor, and then, being around during a scandal like this, we know that Jonathan Mattingly experienced somebody trying to deflect blame for wrongdoing. And he may have even, if there were people asking questions, he was almost definitely told, like, say this, not that, say this, not that. This is what you're allowed to say. Like, and I'll be honest, like in this interview, if I like that he gave to ABC, if I didn't know the details of the case, if I hadn't, very obsessively been trying to read about the details of the case, being like, okay, what's going on? Let me parse this out. What's the actual issue here? If I didn't know the details of that, he would have done a very convincing job of deflecting that blame. And I think that he's counting on people not knowing the details, because I know that I know of his involvement with the IFB, and I know that these are three scandals that he was there for, presumably. And so I know to look at these sort of things. And it's the sort of thing where if you, like we keep saying over and over, you wouldn't see it if you weren't looking for it specifically. But because we know what to look for, it's all over the place. Like if there's one thing about the IFB that we understand that they will always frame systemic abuses, be they sexual abuse, child abuse, whatever. They will always frame systemic abuses as a bunch of individual moral failings to preserve the system, rather than saying this is an actual systemic issue that we need to look at. And if you look at what Mattingly has done here, he said, with this warrant, with this search, and with this shootout that we got into, it wasn't, we shouldn't have been in there in the first place. We really got this warrant based off of really faulty information, and they shouldn't have given us the warrant in the first place, because who we were looking for, that we said, we're certain that this guy's going to be there. He wasn't there, and no one was there that they were looking for, and they killed somebody else by mistake. Like, rather than framing that as a systemic failure, they've been like, well, everything would have been fine if we'd have just done this tactic instead of this tactic. Like
right.
That's
and what could possibly be more IFB than that? I mean, it's that we know that this guy, Jonathan Mattingly, he went to Hyles Anderson 2 years after the Hyles Nischik scandal. His father still chose to send him and encourage him to go, most likely, to Hyles Anderson College after the Hyles scandal broke. He did, this is after the Hyles scandal broke, and then just before the A.V. Ballinger scandal broke. And we know his father continued to support First Baptist Church of Hammond until at least 2009, because I know that because I've been to conferences at his church, and we have listeners who have been to conferences at his church. We know that Jack Scott spoke at Shawnee Baptist Church when Lonnie Mattingly was the pastor sometime in the early 2000s, 2004-ish.
So they remained in the same camp.
Yes. But John Mattingly saw all of this stuff happen, and he saw these sexual abuse scandals at his dad's church covered up. And he has been taught to not see things as a systemic abuse problem. And now he's on ABC claiming that there's no systemic abuse problem. And I feel like this has got to be all related.
Yeah, well, so one of the things we also want to go back to, because in episode 2 of this show, we talked about the issues relating to racism as like a doctrine within the IFB. And we can't talk about this Breonna Taylor shooting without talking about police brutality against Black people and police killings of Black people, specifically with regards to race and stuff like that.
And we talked about in that episode how the roots of racism in this country are religious. And like it's not that religion 100% causes racism, but that
it's used as a justification for
you cannot completely untangle American racism from misuse of scripture and misuse of Christianity, specifically the curse of Ham doctrine and how that was used as justification to get Christian people to enslave people.
Right. And see, we can't say for sure, what is in Officer Mattingly's head. Like, that would just be, I would be wrong if I could say that. However, I can say that I know he has been brought up in and raised within a system that has these sorts of beliefs in it. Mm-hmm. So
Hiles Anderson College was still discouraging interracial relationships at the time that he went there.
Yeah.
And I would put, and I can't tell you what he did or didn't hear before I was ever alive, but I would put an awful lot of money on the fact on him having been presented with the curse of Ham doctrine. I would put so much money on that.
Well, we know people who were at Hiles Anderson College at the same time as he was.
Mm-hmm.
So we know what through talking to those people, we know what the pervasive culture was at this Bible college during that time. So we know what the IFB culture was like during that time because we know people, we've talked to people, and we can say, well, if you were there at this time, then you would have been exposed to this. You would have been hearing this type of rhetoric, this type of propaganda. And whether or not you really take that to heart is all going to be up to you. But there's going to be a certain amount of it that even if you're trying to reject it, you're still going to absorb it via osmosis just because it's so prevalent.
Right. And like we talked about before, that kind of bad teaching and bad philosophy and bad theology, it doesn't just go away. You've got to actually actively expunge it from yourself.
Yeah.
That does not just disappear. That's something that you've got to deprogram yourself. But and not only, was Hiles Anderson and the IFB movement of the 90s a actively racist environment, we're also talking about an actively misogynist environment.
Right. Well, we know that because of all of the abuse.
Right. It's also a toxic and actively abusive environment. Hiles Anderson was compared to boot camp and being over in the IFB movement as a whole, being overworked and traumatized was glorified, and it's institutionalized PTSD that you can get from being in a place like that. And I would again, this is conjecture, but I would wager that Jonathan Mattingly had an upbringing not too dissimilar from what I had. In the sense that
your father was also an IFB
my dad was also an IFB pastor. So I'm sure that Mattingly was also going to soul winning on Saturdays and being expected to do a lot of work for the church. And it's like, I'm sure that he at some point, ran into the toxicity and the abusiveness of the IFB environment, whether that was at Hiles Anderson or before.
Yeah.
And he grew up in an environment that was anti-education and anti-progress and extremely politically conservative.
It's so very reactionary.
Extremely reactionary. And It's not like what I really wanted to say. It's not that attending First Baptist Church of Hammond or attending an IFB church or going to Hiles Anderson College makes you by default or by definition a murderer or a racist or a misogynist.
No. Of course.
Of course not. Like there are plenty of people who have learned, oh, these are the things that I messed up and I'm not going to do them anymore, and are better people and are not racists or murderers that at one point were in the IFB. Or even still are, frankly. But these environments, they teach racism, they teach anger and rage and outrage, and they teach misogyny. So if someone were going to fire on a Black woman, or if someone were going to serve a sloppy no-knock warrant for potentially racist reasons, would it shock you that that person was taught institutional racism and was taught institutional misogyny?
Yeah, and just to clarify that you've said that Mattingly is not the person who actually fired any of the shots.
No, but he's a person who he was
involved in the
right. He allowed a sloppy warrant to be served. Like the very least that we can say is that this was definitely this was sloppy. This was not thought all the way through.
And he was complicit, at least in this situation.
Right. And I'm not saying that, so at the very least, we can say he made a bad call. Now, my personal feelings are that he did way worse than that, but completely objectively, he made a terrible, terrible call. And I'm not saying that Hyles Anderson or the IFB movement made him make that call. But I just want to ask, would these traits that we've talked about of the IFB movement and of Hyles Anderson College make someone more likely or less likely to make a bad decision on the level that Jonathan Mattingly did?
Right. And so that brings me to something else that I want to talk about. Because if I were running a police department, and say I were I were running a police department, I were a police officer or like a police captain or something, or police commissioner, I'd just been promoted to the superintendent or the commissioner or whatever of a local police department. And I were like, well, I want to make my police department very, trusted, very by the book, that sort of thing. And I'm just putting myself in the shoes of somebody like that. And I get somebody who is applying to be a police officer, going through police academy, stuff like that. And I find out, oh, well, this guy, he's not just a Christian, because, like any religion can be a police officer if they want to. This guy is really part of a group that has a lot of these fringe beliefs. And they really like somebody who is a member of the IFB, somebody who has been raised in what is clearly like such a racist environment, that would at least set off a red flag for me, where I should say, hey, wait a minute, we should look at this person's religious beliefs and see if that might actually be a cause of bias in the case of maybe the way that they would conduct themselves as an officer, because
the way that they would make difficult decisions, like when do we use a no-knock warrant?
Yeah, and that might not have been this guy's decision. For all we know, that might not have been this guy's decision. But the fact that somebody who was raised in such a deeply prejudiced environment was able to stay as a police officer for like almost 30 years of this guy's life. He was a police officer, and from what I can tell, he was thriving in that position. That says a lot to me, that somebody who is like part of one of these fringe religious groups could be so successful and, fit in so well for so long within this department. I mean, that's like a canary in the coal mine right there. That's almost like the definition of a canary in the coal mine.
Yeah,
you see what I'm saying?
That is a disturbing thought. And it's like, to be completely honest, I've known men within the IFB that were in law enforcement. Mm-hmm. And I've known some that I don't have any more problem with than I have with any police officer. Right. It's like, well, I have a problem with you because you're complicit in a system that isn't working. I have a problem with you because you're complicit in a system that hurts people unnecessarily, but no more than any other police officer of like, this is a system that's got to get fixed or taken apart and put back together again in a different way.
Like this guy's not, going out of his way to attack people.
Like I've known IFB cops that were no worse than any other cop. However,
but I feel like that says a lot more about like regular cops than it does about IFB cops.
Yeah, true that. But what I think I just can't let go of the connection here. The IFB is a racist place, racist system.
It is.
And it's a system where you're conditioned. I mean, is there any way that Jonathan Mattingly was conditioned to think that things would always be covered up for him because he watched his father and he watched Jack Hiles and he watched the administration at Hiles-Anderson College cover up for other people? Like, maybe that led him to think that like, oh, well, covering up for people is what we do. Or that when somebody makes a bad decision, it's not really their fault. It was just the devil tempting them and like they should get forgiven and restored. Like the mindset that he exhibits. And the mindset. We
do love a good redemption narrative, don't we?
Ugh. I don't know. I think I might be over redemption narratives. But yeah, it's not. And I think we've made our point that it's not that this makes you a bad person, or it's not that it's not that, Breonna Taylor died because of the IFB. But there is a connection, and I don't think that connection should be ignored.
No. I mean, I sent emails, I sent Twitter messages to several journalists who, for major publications who were covering this. I was like, maybe this is something that you want to take a look into. And none of them got back to me.
You have to understand,
I mean, their inboxes are probably full. I know my
true.
brother's a journalist, and he gets like so many messages from so many people about so many different things. And he's like, a lot of this stuff isn't newsworthy. This, maybe it's newsworthy, but like, I feel like unless we can push, like, unless they can really like find something that was like X caused Y, then it feels like you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, and we don't have that. We don't have this caused that.
No, we don't. But it's something to look at, and it's something to pay attention to.
Right, but this is a connection. It's a discussion and it's a connection. But what I wanted to say is Gavi, like, how many hours have you spent in the world of the IFB at this point?
I mean, just the amount of time
how many hours though? Think about all the hours that we spent writing episodes, recording episodes, when you edit them, when you research things.
Yeah.
Right. You've spent hundreds of hours in this psychological world of the IFB.
As a guest.
Right. And
not
of
as
course
a permanent resident.
Right. But you wouldn't have made this connection, months and months ago either, before you started researching these things with me.
Right.
Anyway.
I don't know. The last thing that I want to say about this is that so in the intro to most of the episodes that we have, I say something along the lines of, we do this podcast because we want to educate and inform our listeners about the clear and present danger that the IFB and other cult groups have on society as a whole. Where here is an example of IFB culture and somebody who is a member, somebody who had a strong IFB upbringing, being involved in a violent act that not only claimed an innocent life, but was also a catalyst for massive social upheaval across the country. Massive social unrest and divisiveness, like within our society and within our country and even worldwide. So when I say things like that, when I say, the IFB and like other, cult groups and stuff like that, and fundamentalist Christian, and people who are really extreme about that sort of thing, when I say that these groups pose a danger, I'm not joking. I'm not just saying that because it sounds good in an intro. I'm saying that because I honestly believe it. And this is just another example of why.
Right. And I think this is a great example of the idea that very few IFB members are harmful individual humans.
Right.
We
want to make that clear because, no hate.
Right. Even the most sold out IFB family, the mom and the daughters only wear skirts and they have a bunch of kids, and the dad, wears 80s suits and ties and they don't own a TV. And
I wear a lot of suits and ties from the 80s. But I get them tailored first.
You get them tailored.
These guys are allergic to tailoring.
But no, even the most, if you imagine the most sold out IFB family that you can possibly think of.
Yeah.
Those people, they may be a little weird, but as long as they're not abusing their children, they're not hurting anybody. And people should be allowed to be a little bit weird.
No, I mean, we'll make fun of them on the internet.
Right.
But that's it.
We'll make fun of you on the internet, but people should be allowed to be a little bit weird. And most IFB people are just a little bit weird and really pretty harmless.
Yes, freedom of religion. That's what we're all for, is freedom of religion.
It's the IFB leadership, the higher up you go in that, the more likely, and there are IFB pastors that I trust, people that I've known personally from, friends of my dad's from many, many years ago.
And your father as well when he was IFB. Yeah.
And there are a select few IFB pastors that I actually really trust. Very few, but they exist. It's not the people, it's not the individuals. It's the leadership, and the higher up you go, the more likely you are to have tons and tons of dirt, tons and tons of skeletons in your closet.
Well, how often do we hear that exact same thing said about the police?
Yeah.
The police departments where we know that there are individual police officers who are I want to do right by my community. And then when you get higher and higher and higher up and you see the way that the system is built, more and more of the system is built where it's just going to be implicitly biased against some people other than others. And if you're an officer, even if you do everything right, there's nothing that you can do to avoid that.
Right. It's not necessarily the individuals that are the problem. It's the philosophy. It's the system. The IFB system is what I'm here to speak out about. And that's why I don't name people on this show unless they're my friends and they give me their permission to, or unless they are, convicted criminals.
Or unless they're an abuser that we want to just say,
or
this person is an
abuser and there's tons of evidence and it's very clear that I am naming the right person.
Yeah. Or if it's somebody like Jonathan Mattingly, who is a public figure. He is a public figure.
But there's a reason that I don't name individual IFB people, even if I have a beef with them or whatever.
Right.
Because it's not them. It's not the person. It's not the member. It's the philosophy. The IFB philosophy and the IFB system is harmless. It's harmful. It is abusive. It is toxic. And I am not going to ever be ashamed for saying that. I'm never going to stop saying.
And it's also very heavily normalized within right-wing circles of American culture, that sort of behavior.
Right. And it's not the people that we're here to speak against, except for the people who need speaking against. It's the system.
It's the system.
And I am never, ever going to shut up about, this is a system that creates monsters. This is a system that is bad. Yeah.
And on that note, I think that it's about time for us to end this episode. It's been a short one, but it's something that we just had to say because it's a still developing story and it's of massive importance to us.
Yeah, and this was a little
get out. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, go for it.
No, this was a little bit of a ramble, but we wanted to have more of a discussion type episode and kind of contextualize the feelings of people like me and like our listener who turned us on to the ABC 2020 episode where we saw that Jonathan Mattingly attended Hyles-Anderson and got our minds completely blown. And I wanted to talk about my feelings, about that and where this makes my mind go. And I think I've done a pretty good job of getting that out there. Because it gave me a lot of big feelings. And I'm really glad we got to kind of go into some of those.
Yeah. Well, I guess I usually say this stuff at the beginning. If you like this podcast, if you enjoy this podcast, please recommend it to your friends, your family, your coworkers, people you don't like. as well. They're still valuable to us as listeners. You can join our Facebook group. It's called Eden Exodus. You find that on Facebook. We're going to definitely be having a big discussion about this. We've been having some good discussions lately in the group. It's been fun. Also, you can join our Patreon. The Patreon, if you want to support us financially. Sadie, do you want to plug your social media?
Yeah, you can follow me on Instagram at Sadie Carpenter Music or on Twitter at Hell Yes Sadie.
What about TikTok?
TikTok. You can follow me on TikTok. Right now, my screen name on there is Sadie Carpenter 1. I'll let you know when I come up with something more fun to change it to. I'm too old for this.
The social media for the podcast is at Leaving Eden Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, at Leaving Eden Pod on Twitter. If you want to, if you have opinions about stuff, if you want to talk to us, you can send us a message, an email, leavingedenpod@gmail.com, and then you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I am at GAVRIELHACOHEN. And we will be back next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
But